Hey y'all, welcome back to the Book Stamp. Today we're going to be talking about my favorite books featuring women in STEM. So STEM is an acronym that stands for Science, Technology, Engineering, and Math, and this is a area of the US workforce that has historically and for the most part currently been extremely male dominated. I am in a STEM field. My degree is in aerospace engineering, and I will soon be entering the engineering workforce as soon as I finish my master's degree. Specifically, aerospace engineering is currently about 11% women, which is one of the lowest percentages of any STEM field currently. It is an area that has actually been losing women as time has progressed. So the inclusion of women in STEM is something that is very, very important to me personally. And as a natural reflection of that, I really enjoy reading books that feature women in science. I'm actually not going to be mentioning any books about women in aerospace in this video. I covered them already in my space book talk because I think it's much more important to put those voices at the forefront of the area that they are in rather than sort of sequestering them off in their own women entitled video. But I read so much more than just space books, so I wanted to feature some of my absolute favorites of books with women in STEM in them in fields that are not really my area of expertise, but I've still really loved learning about them because in my humble opinion, I do find that books about science written by women are typically better. Historically, women have been erased from science since the beginning of time, and one of my actual favorite quotes is about the invention of the calendar, and it's, "What man needs to track something every 28 days?" Something to think about. But anyways, let's go ahead and get into the books. So I have books that sort of span a lot of different areas of science, and so we'll start off with nature and biological type science. Definitely not my area, but I do love reading about it. The first book I'm going to recommend, which I don't know if you've been on BookTube and haven't read this book yet, but is Where the Crawdads Sing by Delia Owens. In this book, our main character, Kaya, is essentially a homegrown naturalist. She writes really beautiful, groundbreaking work about the biology of her local community. And to think of her not as a woman of science, I think is a discredit truly to her character, even though she does not participate in sort of the much more formal, organized science of her husband. But she still is making really important contributions to the scientific community throughout the book. And it's just such an incredible story. So I definitely recommend Where the Crawdads Sing, along with almost everyone else who's read it. The second book I'm going to recommend is Lab Girl by Hope Jared. Hope is such a beautiful writer. I really love in this book how she ties her personal experiences as a scientist into the science that she's doing. It is one of the easiest reads about nature. She is a geobiologist. She's a tenured professor at the University of Hawaii with her own lab now. And so you get to learn so much about how she learned about trees and the environment that we live in. And she's also a really, really great climate change writer. So I haven't read her book about climate change. I'll put a picture of it here because I can't remember the title off the top of my head, but I've heard great things about it. So if you want a more climate changey book, you can read that as well. But I read this year and it was so good. It's just, she is such a good writer. So I definitely recommend reading this if you like more memoir type books. It's very good. So moving sort of from the biology side to more of a medical perspective, we have The Story of Jane, the legendary underground feminist abortion service by Laura Kaplan. So this story covers the underground abortion service called Jane, which functioned in the 1960s, I think, right before Roe v. Wade was passed, and how this abortion service really provided relief to so many women across the United States of America when finding a safe way to have an abortion was extremely difficult, because as we know, if you ban abortion, women don't stop having abortions, they just stop having safe abortions. And so one of the really interesting things I found about this book was sort of how the women decided to take their health in their own hands, because at that point in time, medicine, we don't really think of it this way now, but medicine was extremely male dominated, where you had men who knew very little about women's bodies telling women what they were supposed to do with them, forbidding them from getting birth control. And so these women decided to take their bodies in their own hands and started performing these abortions themselves, because truthfully, it's not a complicated medical procedure at all. And so this book really opened my eyes to so many things about how women have historically been distanced from their bodies and really reclaiming that as an act of power. So for a social justice / medical read, I definitely recommend this book. Another book discussing a lot of the health around women's bodies is The Radium Girls, which this book tells the story of the women who painted radium dials for the United States military. So back in World War II, a lot of soldiers had radium dialed watches because they glowed in the dark, as well as a lot of the components on aircraft were painted with radium so that they glowed. Of course, we know now radium is radioactive and it is extremely unsafe, but at the time, the book talks a lot about who knew that and who didn't. But these women were basically given these extremely high-paying jobs during the war where they would paint the dials of these watch faces, and they were taught to dip the brush in the paint, and then they would suck on it essentially to make their brush nice and fine. And of course, this means they were ingesting an extremely unhealthy amount of radium into their bodies. It's really, it would make a good October read because it's very grotesque what happens to these women's bodies and how the companies that hired them basically didn't do anything to protect these women. And so as they were dying, it's really one of the first workers' rights cases about really holding companies accountable for what they do to their workers. So it's definitely an interesting read, and it focuses so deeply on these women, and it gets a little tear-jerky there at the end, but I definitely recommend it. One of the other books I read this year was Uncanny Valley by Anna Wiener, and this book covers her experience as she essentially worked customer service for a lot of tech startup companies, but through that she actually ended up writing a lot of code, and so it's a really sort of personal look at how Silicon Valley has become this bro culture area, what the culture really means, and it was so interesting. She has a English and publishing background, so she's a phenomenal writer. It's a beautiful read. One of my favorite parts was where her boss at a tech company she was working for basically was like, oh, you should learn to code, blah blah blah, and she was like, yeah, I went home and I learned to code, but it's just boring. And I'm not a super strong coder, but I definitely agree that I find it extremely boring and annoying as a thing to do, and it's not where my interests really lie. But it was just such a deep dive into the culture and understanding sort of how that culture is really shaping America right now was really, really well done. So I would definitely recommend that if you like sort of more of the tech startup, coding, computer science type of STEM writing. And finally, I have my copy of Women in Science by Rachel Ignofosky. I have a signed copy, which I'm absolutely in love with. And this book, if you have a younger girl in your life, a cousin, a niece, a nephew who you think is really interested in STEM, I definitely recommend this book. This is one of my favorite pages about Rosalind Franklin, who is one of my all-time heroes. But it just has these beautiful pictures and text about over 100 women in science, ranging from the ancient Egyptian era up till now, covering women of all backgrounds. She actually developed this book as a supplement for teachers, so it follows a lot of the standards of learning for middle elementary school. So it's definitely a good read to pick up for a kid in your life. So it is focusing on women in STEM, but as she said, a lot of boys really, really like the book because of the way that it's structured. So definitely don't only buy it for the women in your life, but I love this book so much. I love the art. I have some of it framed in my house. Definitely pick this one out as well. Well, thank you for hanging out for some women in STEM, who are some of my favorite women in the whole world. And let me know if you liked this video, if you found it helpful, if you think a follow-up would be really nice, because I read so much of this literature that I would be happy to do that. So please drop a comment down below and let me know. Again, thanks for hanging out, y'all.